Hi folks, with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this radio audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to compare the government processes, procedures, and functions of a communist government as opposed to a fascist government. Now, I think we all know that fascism gets the bad rap. You know, you say something to me, you're a fascist. Hardly anybody using the term has any idea what it means, but it's the go-to. You know, you're a fascist. Next step is you're Hitler, and so it goes like that. Communism, on the other hand, certainly amongst the college kids and the globalists and World Economic Forum flunkies, they tout communism. You know, it wasn't that bad. You know, okay, look, it didn't quite work out. A bit of fine tuning, and then that's all we need. And if you look at the headline or the umbrella sort of position of communism, it's a world where all outcomes are equal. Everybody's equal. Now, of course, it doesn't work that way, but that's the. Now, if you're a college kid, and I succumbed to this as a senior, well, partially. I saw the shortcomings in it, but it's attractive to a lot of people if they're living in an uncertain world, if they're lazy, if they're people of limited ability, if they're the folks who always come last in the school exams, or they try and run the 100-meter race and they were always last, or this sort of thing. If those sort of people think, well, communism's fantastic, or women where particularly communism has a big attraction for women because all outcomes are supposed to be equal, and this is something that attracts minorities. And if you look at the people that were attracted to communism, certainly say from the mid 1800s, when Karl Marx was putting together the Communist Manifesto, he's considered to be, along with Hegel and those sort of people, that, if you like, the sort of the father of communism. If you look at their view, or the people that were most attracted to it were Jews, homosexuals, lesbians, and later on, particularly in the later 1800s, early 1900s, black people and revolutionaries in, say, South America, channeling the Che Guevara, Fidel Castro type look, but the idea of communism that it puts forward is it's a paradise where everyone's equal. That has a lot of attraction to people. A lot of folks, the majority, I would think, would be attracted to that. Now, if you're hardworking, industrious, capable, and you're used to doing well in exams, if you train hard and used to coming in the first three in the 100-meter race, then you don't think so much about communism. But those sort of people, those sort of abilities and those sort of drive and energy and focus and commitment, they're never ever in any society will they be the majority. And they're the only ones that primarily would look at communism and go, oh, I don't like the look of that. Even the people who are against communism, say in the first world countries, their primary concern wasn't that they agreed or disagreed with communism per se. It was more that communism wants to seize their property, arbitrarily declare them as enemies of the people and capitalist bourgeois enemies, this sort of thing. So they didn't like the idea of arbitrary, the disregard of property law, seizing property arbitrarily, and then arbitrary legal processes based around ideology. Those were always the concerns of people who were against it, the property owners, that sort of thing. But I just want to get closer to the essence of communism and fascism and compare the two. Now, this fascism being the go-to for it's pure evil and it's the most evil of the evil, and Hitler, that's very much built around a certain narrative that says that anything nationalistic must be evil by extension. We'll come back to that because it's really the crux of the matter. Now, if you look at the FBI in the early sort of iteration of the FBI, if you like, in the 1920s and 1930s, even before the Great Depression kicked off, which ushered quite a lot of people into considering communism as another form of government, thinking that capitalism really had failed, given the fallout from the Great Depression from late 1929. So they say, well, capitalism's failed. What other forms of government are there? So a lot of people are looking at communism, some of them not very seriously, but saying, well, hey, it's an alternative. Would it work? Some were sort of attracted into it. Others walked away from it. Others looked at it more out of curiosity, that sort of thing. But the FBI did a profile of the people who were attracted to communism and who were its main supporters, who spoke of it glowingly, and who openly wanted a communist society. This is in the United States. And the list they drew up is the same people that agitate for globalization today, which is, if you like, a form of communism for the masses, but the elites can keep all their private. That's a sort of a different or new iteration of communism, the globalization that we're seeing being forced upon us at the moment. But the FBI did a list, and they came up with a profile. Rather, they came up with it was Jews. Jews were number one in communism, and of those Jews, the Jewish homosexuals and lesbians were at the absolute top. Again, we see that today. I mean, nothing's changed in 100 years. And then they went to educated black people, again, particularly lesbians and homosexuals. So wherever you got a minority there of Jews, lesbians, homosexuals, and so on, that's where the core, the hard kernel of the communist actors were. Doesn't mean that there weren't people outside of that, but they were the primary group. So, or thus the FBI, I believe. Now, that's hardly a matter for contention today, whether you like that or not. That's kind of how it was. And Jews have always dreamed on the horse, for a long time, certainly since there was recorded. Jews have always dreamed of a situation where they'd be considered on equal to all the Gentiles. Remember, the Jews inserted themselves around in numerous Gentile societies and wanted to keep all the customs and habits and so on, and practices, and stay very much in group, hiring each other and rewarding each other, that sort of thing, but wanted to be treated as if they were exactly the same as the Gentiles. It was a big ask, and that they, in terms of the writings you look at, feel they were rather hard done by if they didn't get that outcome. So when communism came along, Karl Marx was Jewish, and so was Engels. I mean, Engels had quite a wealthy family, but his industrialists, but they took the view the Gentiles never really treated them as equals, and so social equals and equal otherwise, even though they were quite well to do. And so they, Marx and Engels, had this view that they, and this came out in the Communist Manifesto, or later on in Das Kapital, really, which was published, I think, what would it have been, or 20 or so years later, or after the Communist Manifesto. So Marx had this idea of this nirvana where it would be equal for Jews, that Jews would be considered equal. Now, in order to say, well, we just want a society that's equal for Jews, then instead of that, it's, well, we want a society where everybody is equal, Jews included, or everybody included. And that was really the genesis of what today we see as communism, a society where Jews are considered as equals to the Gentiles, and in order to do that, the whole society has to be changed. We still see that today, where you just insert one-legged black lesbian into a company, then the entire company has to change their behaviour for that one person. So you see that same mentality and that same sense of logic applying. So any sort of nationalistic Gentile sort of group or whatever, then someone has to be inserted in there to say, look, there you go, there are the Nazis, at it again. And so it's very much if you like, a Jewish way of dealing with these things, or perceiving them rather than dealing with them. So communism went along those lines, and if you look at the people, the main shaker movers in the revolutions around Europe, whether they be in France, Germany, or elsewhere, particularly following World War One, then you'll see that Jews, and particularly Jewish homosexuals and lesbians, are very much at the forefront of this. Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg in Germany is a case in point, but others. Trotsky in the Soviet Union and the Bolshevik Revolution. The list goes on. So Jews are heavily overrepresented in the revolutionary activities of post-World War One Europe. Now, whereas Marx, wasn't averse to the idea of the population may all get up one day and decide we want a communist society. He didn't necessarily think that would happen. He thought it's more likely it would happen in industrial societies. But the more likely way was that it had to come through revolution, that a communist society would be imposed on the people whether they liked it or not. Hey, we're a bunch of intellectuals and ideological fanatics. We're imposing this on you, and if you don't like it, we'll kill you. So it's hardly a warm, embracing sort of governmental policy, that. But the idea of imposing communism through revolution became bedrock in the whole communist thinking. If you look at the constitution of the Soviet Union, they were committed in their constitution. They were committed to spreading world worker revolution. Workers of the world unite, and they were singing songs like the Internationale, which, I mean, have a look at that on you. It's quite a good song, or quite a good melody. If you look at the Internationale on YouTube, it was the song of the workers that they were singing. I think it was from the early 1900s onwards. Still singing it today, incidentally. And so imposing a communist society by revolution without the support of the people. The people's agreement wasn't necessary. They were ushering in a paradise, and they were bringing in a new world of a nirvana, a new form of heaven. So the people's agreement or support or anything like that wasn't necessary. It's a bit like the global warming thing or the climate change thing. People support an agreement or whatever isn't necessary. We're saving the world. We're saving the fucking world. We don't need their fucking agreement for that. And this was very much the communist view of imposing government or through revolution without the support of the people. Now, if you disagreed with the communist position, whether it be Pol Pot or whether it be Soviet Union, Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin and those guys, or Chairman Mao in China, or wherever. It doesn't really matter if you disagree. Even the softer forms of communism that you might have found in Eastern Europe, they weren't as hard and vicious as the Soviet or Chinese ones. But where it's imposed through, nor was that imposed through violent revolution necessarily in Eastern Europe. The Soviet communists subverted any elections and so on. And as we know with elections, it's not who votes, it's who counts the votes that decides the outcome. And the Soviets made sure that their goons and stooges and flunkies won the election and then imposed a one-party state. So that wasn't done through revolution. So it tended not to be quite as, it was brutal, sure enough, but it tended to be not quite as brutal as the Soviet system, which was imposed through violent revolution and much loss of life. Now, if you disagree with the communists, they would kill you. The idea is that because it's a government imposed by revolution without the support of the people, the government is never legitimate, right? And they know that deep down, and so do the people. The government is never legitimate, so they artificially create legitimacy by killing people who disagree with them, or arbitrarily imprisoning them, or torturing them, or beating the shit out of them, or sending them off to Arctic gulags and this sort of stuff. So that's how they create consent, by terrorizing the people. Some of the people sort of were better off. I suppose the people in the lowest 20% of society ended up being better off through communism, but through a lower quality of life. How do you measure that? Do you measure their quality of life through whether they have TV sets or whether they have running water or a flushing toilet? Like, how do you measure that quality of life? You're taking people away from villages, farming villages that they've lived at for hundreds of years. Their family lived at for hundreds of years, where they're agricultural peasants, but they live off the produce of the land. So when you try and measure their lifestyle by income, it's a bit hard because they're consuming the produce around, the eggs that the hens lay and the milk you get from the cow and all that sort of stuff. And so it's their quality of life They're not paying rent or a mortgage. They've had that house pass through generations. They get their heating from natural resources around them. They okay, they haven't got electricity. Okay, they haven't got a flushing toilet, but they've got seepage system. They're living a decent quality of life with a family, the people around them who they love and who they've known, the relatives and people they know in the village, that sort of stuff. And the communists uprooted these people. No, you're going to the fucking city, and you're going to work in a dirt floor factory. And if you don't like that, we will kill you. So this is hardly an uptick in quality of life. But anyway, that was the communist thing. Now let's contrast fascism, and we can use Germany or Italy, or even to some extent Pinochet's Chile, lesser extent in that case. But now Hitler had the view that he wanted the support of the people. He didn't want to be the German prime minister or leader unless the people wanted him. Now, in the multi-party system that Germany had, electoral system, where there was like a gazillion political parties, it was very rare that any party would get more than 25 to 30% of the vote. It was very rare. And so typically there were coalitions of 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 parties at times, political parties that would form a government. There's a minimum of 53% of the vote to form a government. So now for I think from about 1927 onwards, around that time, the Nazi Party, the Socialist Party, they were the National Socialist Party. They were the biggest party by far. At one stage, getting close to 45% of the vote, which in a electoral system with that many parties, 45% is just massive. It's stratospheric. So they were the biggest party by far. So when Germany was going through a lot of instabilities, they were in the early 1930s, communist street gangs, constant attempts at communist revolution, communist street gangs going around intimidating government officials and beating up judges and all that sort of stuff. Then given the chaos of the time, the President Hindenburg, on the advice of one of the aristocratic politicians, Franz von Papen, to look, give Hitler the. Hitler's the only, because he's the biggest party. He's the only guy that creates stability. So let's make him chancellor. And my party, this is von Papen's party, that had like 8 or 9% of the vote, somewhere around that, joined with Hitler's party to give them that 53% and get them over the line. So Hitler was appointed chancellor and prime minister, but out of the 11 senior ministries of government, the Nazis only had 2. The rest were filled by von Papen's much smaller party. Like von Papen had like 5th, 6th or something of the votes that the Nazi party had. He was small potatoes in the overall scheme of things, but they still held the majority of ministries and other significant posts. So von Papen said to Hindenburg, "Look, we'll wait till this Hitler guy, because he's got a big political party. He'll wait till he calms things down, smooths things over, and gets things, gets the population calm and stops the disorder on the streets, and then we'll just get rid of him. He's a damn lower class guy anyway. Us aristocrats are the ones who are supposed to run the government, not some lower." Lower social dude like him. I mean, he's a fucking corporal in the army, for Christ's sake. We can't have someone like that running the country. But the Nazis or the fascists had a view that they must have popular support. So when Hitler becomes chancellor, they go to work pretty quickly to deliver on their platform, which is to create jobs and so on. And Hitler employed a guy he didn't particularly like, and Hitler was good at gathering guys around him who were capable at doing certain things. And Dr. Schacht, I think his name was, Schacht, was the economics whiz, and he did a lot of good work in improving the economy. And unemployment was quite high at the time, and prices weren't. Inflation wasn't huge, not like it was in the early 1920s, where they had hundreds, if not thousands of percent of inflation. But the the prices were. Now Hitler brought all this under control, and I just want to. This is before the business with the concentration camps or anything like that. The fascists had, well, let's celebrate our nationality, let's celebrate our citizens, let's celebrate our fellow citizens, let's celebrate our achievements, let's celebrate our accomplishments, whether it be in philosophy, arts, engineering or science or whatever. And the Germans had a great deal to celebrate in that. They're at the time, and from the mid 1800s onwards, Germany was becoming very advanced in steel production, high quality steel, interchangeability of parts, micro engineering, chemicals, opticals, microscopes, and all sorts of things like that. So Germany was doing very, very well. So there's a huge amount to celebrate. So the fascists, and Mussolini was the same. Let's celebrate our country. Let's celebrate our history. Let's celebrate our culture. Let's celebrate our fellow citizens. And I don't know what's wrong with that. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. But globalists today would view that as, oh, wow, that's terrible. Now, once you start celebrating your nationality and celebrating your history and your culture, once you start doing that, there's a natural disinclusion element here. And following the 1930s and 1940s, the Jewish propaganda diaspora sees this as being a dagger to the heart of international Jewry. But once you start going down the path of nationalism, then Jews are not included because, unlike sort of belonging to a nation state, they're sprinkled, the Ashkenazi Jews, they're sprinkled throughout numerous countries, whether it be Britain or places in Europe or the United States, Canada, Australia. And so nationalism is something that they see as automatically, that we know where this is going to lead. This is a direct path to expulsion of the Jewish diaspora. And so so the idea of nationalism is seen by the globalists because it's where the globalists have to create absolute social division. So society effectively collapses as a cohesive organized group, and then globalist, which is a form of communism, globalization can then be imposed. And it's not quite at the point of a gun yet, but it's almost there. Look at the one, January 6th and all that sort of stuff. This is, people being arbitrarily arrested and just thrown in prison and kept in solitary and denied due legal process. So we're not far away from doing things at the point of a gun. It's very close. It's just around the corner. So, this celebration of the nation and the people and the culture and the history and so on, this was very much the path that the fascists went down. Whether it be Hitler or Mussolini, or even, again, to not quite the same extent, Pinochet in Italy. And now, reading the accounts of when Hitler would travel around Germany especially sort of 1933 to 1936. And from 1934, the effects of the National Socialist policies were already starting to be obvious. Unemployment was coming down sharply. Consumer goods were becoming available. And there were a lot of things like the autobahns were being built. And so people's lives were very quickly and very materially improved with Hitler as the prime minister, or the chancellor, as they call it in Germany. So this was something that played out in the street. So Hitler could drive around in an open car with really quite minimal security in the overall scheme of things, and he would go to they're driving through a German village, and people would see who it was, and they would come out, and he would do autographs and this is the village didn't even know he was coming. And he would stop. Then he would stop at, say, like a cafe or something like that in the village, and the place would go hysterical, and people would start coming in and wanting his autograph. And he was viewed very positive. So the support that the Nazis had, again, this is pre-concentration camp type stuff. The support the Nazis had was immense, and I don't think there's even a shadow of a doubt that if they'd held an election, in 1937 or 36 or something like that, that they would have won in absolute landslide. Not because they were arbitrarily arresting anybody or imposing revolution or anything like that, but because they were delivering on their platform. And again, this idea of that the people had to support. Now, the other thing the Nazis were or the fascists, and the two terms aren't necessarily interchangeable, was they believed in the rule of law and due legal process. Now, there were limits to that. If you were a citizen, you could get that. But if you were, Jewish gypsy, if you were a communist activist or a practicing homosexual, lesbian, or something, then the rule of law was a little bit different. It was not applied with any sort of rigor. And again, if you were a Jewish citizen, they were treating the Jews. In Germany, this is treating the Jews through the legal system in the same way that, say, straight white male Christians are being treated in the West today. So it was that type of comparison. But the difference is, you say, well, gee, that's terrible. And it is, by the way, due legal process should be applied at all times. Everybody should be equal under the law. That's, I believe, that's absolutely essential for any nation state. Nonetheless, the fascists said to the Jewish diaspora, and in Germany had a population of, give or take 80 million, there were about 400,000 Jews, and said, well, look, we'd like you to leave. And they said the same thing to the gypsies, and same thing to the homosexuals and the lesbian activists. They look, we'd like you to leave. And if you're going to stir up trouble, then we'll put you in prison. And about 200,000 Jews did leave, going to all over the world, America and wherever, guys like Einstein. But the 200,000 least qualified Jews, bear in mind this was a time of international Great Depression where immigration was cut back heavily because unemployment was so high in each one of these countries. Why take in a shitload of immigrants when you've got rampant unemployment? So that was probably as big a reason as anything as to why the Jews struggled to, all of them struggled to leave. There weren't that many. Now, if you add up the Jews, the gypsies, the communist activists and so on, out of a population of 80 million, there were less than 1 million of these people. So it's a very small number of people that were being disadvantaged by this. And they weren't being disadvantaged, they were all allowed to leave. We want you to leave. We'll even help you leave Germany. So that was the initial thing. But not all of them wanted to leave. Some of them wanted to stay as activists. Others were unable to find to immigrate elsewhere. And the gypsies found if they tried to go into another country, they were being kicked out of there, whether it be Poland or somewhere else. But unlike the communists, which would go around, you're a counter-revolutionary, you're a bourgeois, we're going to kill you. The Nazis and the fascists didn't do that. Their respect for the rule of law and for sophisticated first world practice at that stage, their respect for that was pretty high, far more so than the communists. So people weren't being arbitrarily arrested or arbitrarily killed. Now, there were things like the Night of the Long Knives that celebrated, that shows how evil the Nazis were because they killed off political opponents, that sort of thing. But again, we're talking very small numbers here. The communists were killing, like as in the Soviet Union, they were, and the Chinese, they were killing off, millions upon millions tens of millions, multiple tens of millions were being killed. So the Nazis or the fascists were killing off actually a very small number of people. In comparison, that doesn't make it right or good, by the way. But if you want to look at who's the most evil, then the communists by far and away the most evil. They don't respect property. They don't respect arbitrary arrest, arbitrary detention, arbitrary torture, arbitrary relocation, forced relocation, all of these sorts of things. I mean, here's some of the difference. Like the Nazis, the fascists in Germany would say, well, we want to build a factory to make, ball bearings or whatever. And they would look for population centres where, there would be workers and enough workers to work in the factory. Then they say, well, we'll build a factory there and it's closer to raw materials. Now we'll build a railway line to bring iron ore into the factory. They do those. So they try and fit into the environment. Similar to that, I mean, the fascists had this thing of beautifying industrial parks. So they would go to factory areas or industrial areas and say, well, we want you to build nice parks and have lots of trees and green areas. This is the Nazis, by the way. Green areas, places where people can sit and have their lunch. can we do an irrigation like a small stream to go through here, and can we do this and that, and so on. So there was a special department in the fascists to go around and beautify the fascist, beautify the fascist government to beautify these industrial parks. So they would look at putting factories in at the minimum disruption to the population. They didn't want to disrupt the population. They wanted the new factory to fit in with that environment, with that town, with those people, and took a lot of time and care and effort to do it. Now let's look at the communists of the Soviet Union. The factory will be built. They don't want to have to put in extra rail lines, so they're going to build a factory closest to, say, the raw materials or closest to the nearest transport link. But there's not enough people that live there, so they just go to a rural area and say, okay, you move there, or we will kill you, and we will make sure that, and we'll take all the food from your village, so that your relatives will starve. This sort of thing, and then move them to a factory. Now, some of these people coming from rural areas, they've never lived in a city or worked in, but the communists would say, if you arrive late 3 times in 12 months, we will send you to prison. And things like that, and the harshness, and this is arbitrary, the brutality of it. Ideological commissars would be deciding things. There was no such thing going on in fascist Germany or fascist Italy. Not that fascist Italy or Germany were perfect in every way. They weren't. They had their shortcomings as well. But in those essential areas, such as quality of life and these sorts of things, there was a huge difference. The communists were cruel and brutal with imposed government, revolutionary government. They would kill you if you didn't like it. The fascists, by contrast, were much more, we want the support of the people. We want the people to appreciate and desire what we're doing in terms of the economy and creating jobs and again, creating those green, beautiful spaces in factory areas, industrial areas. And so there's a huge difference between the communists and similarly with things like arrest warrants or summonses, things like that. The fascists in Germany were quite meticulous, or certainly until, say, 1943. During the war, quite meticulous about that. Evidence had to be produced to a court. A magistrate had to sign the. This was one of the platforms that the Nazis got elected on, or went to the polls on, was this arbitrary justice crap that was going on, where communist goons could intimidate judges and courts. The Nazis said, "Well, we'll do away with all that crap." The judge makes a decision based on the evidence, and so that was very much part of their thing. The communists were quite the opposite. The evidence doesn't mean squat. This is ideology. This is class struggle, class warfare. We're going to get those damn bourgeois and so on. So very, very different concept of how justice would be applied. And the communists wouldn't let you leave. I mean, they did in some cases, the higher profile people, but they wouldn't let you leave the Soviet Union. You had to stay and you had to change your ways. And again, or they'd kill you or kill your relatives. So the Nazis were and the fascists weren't like that, whether it be in Italy or in Germany. So when you say the fascists, oh, they're evil fascists, you're a fascist, you're fucking Hitler. That's bullshit. The brutality and the arbitrary brutality and cruelty of the communist regimes imposed at the point of a gun, by the way, were far worse than anything the fascists ever did. Now, what's the big issue with fascism? Well, it's what I mentioned earlier, that the issue is the nationalism and admiring your culture and your history, which is why there's so much effort by the globalists and the Western governments they control to attack culture and history in every way they can of the white countries. And there's so much to be proud of and so many accomplishments that it's a big job to crush it all and to say, well, you're all fascist Nazis and you're all Hitler and so on. But the big issue, it's very difficult to impose the sort of government the globalists want to impose with a country that's homogenous, that's nationalist, that's proud of its past, proud of its history, proud of its country. It's very hard to do a takeover there. So they have to crush it all and do so with much aggression. Now, I guess a sidebar, well, not a sidebar, central really is that given the prominence of certain tribes of Abraham in the globalist project, and fans, of course, of communism, is that nationalism automatically militates against the Jews that are dispersed around the world. So as soon as nationalism kicks in to the Jews, that's the red light. It's like you couldn't get a flashing red light bigger than that, because as they would see it, automatically the next step is expulsion of Jews, as happened in Germany in the 1930s. So they perceive it that way, and it's like Pavlov's dog. They just, the minute nationalism mentions, oh, that's it, the persecution of Jews, and they can't separate the two, and they can't see that the persecutions of the past, and particularly in that time, 1930s Europe, the persecutions as they would see it in the past, the conditions for those, what happened then don't exist, as I see it anyway, don't exist anymore. And so, in a modern, intellectually based, as in knowledge-based economy, it's essential the Jews have a seat at assuming they want to call themselves Jews and be Jews and wave the victim card all the time. But essential they have a front row seat, and essential that they're entitled to full due legal process. So nationalism doesn't mean, shouldn't mean, it must never mean, in my view, the due legal process gets suspended for this or that group, arbitrarily suspended. A knowledge economy, requires people capable of working in that higher level of intellectual capacity, and Jews are overrepresented in that, and therefore should have a front row seat and should never be expelled from an economy simply for being Jewish. That's absurd and self-destructive from an economic perspective. So that's the thing there. So fascism is the go-to for pure evil, but compared to communism, compared to the evils, the brutal evils of communism, then fascism, the concentration camps aside, just to say, Mussolini's fascism and so on, it's nowhere near as brutal. And therefore, even if we look at the concentration camp numbers, the numbers killed in the gulags and the pogroms and so on in the Soviet Union, the communist Soviet Union, China, far exceed the deaths through camps. So that needs to be taught, and we need to, I think, put that message out there. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.